On a cold Saturday afternoon in March 1983, surrounded by family members in a Kansas City hospital room, the undisputed boss of the Kansas City mob drew his final breath. Nick Civella died at approximately 4 p.m. at Menorah Medical Center, unable to speak, unable to move, ravaged by lung cancer. He had been released from federal prison just 11 days earlier, granted a compassionate parole so he could, in the words of his attorneys, die in dignity. But there would be no dignity in those final days. The man who had once controlled an empire stretching from Missouri to Las Vegas lay in a hospital bed, silent and unresponsive, his family powerless to do anything but watch. For a man whose words had been his downfall, whose voice captured on FBI wiretaps had exposed an entire criminal syndicate, the irony of dying voiceless seemed almost poetic. This is the story of how Nick Civella rose from the streets of Kansas City's Italian North End to become one of America's most cunning and powerful mob bosses, and how the very technology he feared most would ultimately destroy everything he built. Giuseppe Niccoli Civella was born on March 19, 1912, in the heart of Kansas City's North Side, a neighborhood teeming with Italian immigrants, political corruption, and the promise of the American dream twisted into something darker. His introduction to the criminal justice system came shockingly early. At just 10 years old in 1922, young Nick was hauled before juvenile authorities on charges of incorrigibility. It was a prophetic moment. Shortly after, he dropped out of school, never to return. By the time he turned 20, his rap sheet read like a catalog of petty crime: auto theft, illegal gambling, robbery, vagrancy. In 1932, he served 2 months for bootlegging. The pattern was set. The boy from the North End was becoming a career criminal, but there was something different about Nick Civella that set him apart from the common street thugs of his era. Despite his lack of formal education, those who knew him later in life described him as well-read, articulate, and surprisingly cultured. He loved classical music. He married his wife Catherine in 1934, and they would remain together for nearly 50 years, though they had no children of their own. Civella understood that to survive in the underworld, you needed more than muscle. You needed connections, intelligence, and most importantly, you needed to know when to keep your mouth shut. In the early 1940s, Civella made a crucial career move. He became a Democratic Party precinct worker on Kansas City's North Side, where he forged a relationship with Charles Bonaggio, the boss of the Kansas City crime family and a key figure in the city's notoriously corrupt political machine. After World War II, Civella climbed the family ladder, serving as bodyguard and chauffeur to Anthony Gizzo, one of Bonaggio's top enforcers. When Bonaggio and his bodyguard were gunned down inside the 1st District Democratic Club in April 1950, many believed Gizzo had orchestrated the hit and would take over. Gizzo did become boss, but his reign lasted less than 3 years. When he died in 1953 at age 52, Nick Civella was perfectly positioned to seize control. By the mid-1950s, Civella had become the dominant force in Kansas City's underworld. But he wasn't content to rule just one city. During the 1950 Kefauver hearings on organized crime, federal investigators identified Civella as a, quote, figure to watch. They were right to be concerned. On November 14, 1957, Civella attended what would become one of the most infamous gatherings in American mob history, the Appalachian Meeting in upstate New York, where dozens of mafia bosses from across the country convened at the rural estate of mobster Joseph Barbara. When New York State Police raided the meeting, chaos erupted. Mobsters fled into the woods, some becoming tangled in barbed wire fences, others sliding down brushy hills. But Nick Civella was craftier than most. He and fellow Kansas City mobster Joseph Falardo managed to slip through the roadblocks, made their way to a nearby town, called a cab, and caught a train from the Binghamton station back to Kansas City. They were eventually picked up 15 miles away, but by then, the damage was done. Civella's presence at Appalachian confirmed his status as a major player in the national crime syndicate. Years later, Roy Lee Williams, who would become president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, testified that Civella had told him about the meeting, saying that Among other things, territory and cooperation were discussed. The Appalachian incident had consequences. On June 13, 1960, Civella and his brother Carl, known as Cork, were named among the first 11 entries in Nevada's notorious Black Book, the official list of persons excluded from all casinos in the state. The Kansas City Times reported that Civella was one of 3 men who crossed the country regularly as couriers for the Grand Council of the Cosa Nostra. Being banned from Nevada's casinos was more than an inconvenience. It was a direct threat to Civella's expanding empire, because by the 1960s, Nick Civella had discovered Las Vegas. Through his relationship with Roy Lee Williams and other Teamster officials, Civella gained influence over the Central States Pension Fund, essentially the mafia's private bank. Mob families from Kansas City, Chicago, Milwaukee, and Cleveland used Teamster money to fund casino construction in Las Vegas, and in return, they skimmed millions in untaxed profits directly from the casino counting rooms before the money was ever officially recorded. The beauty of the scheme was its simplicity. Trusted insiders would remove cash from the count rooms and funnel it to mob bosses across the country. The casinos appeared to be making less money than they actually were, taxes went unpaid, and the mafia families grew richer. Civella's operation controlled skimming at several major casinos, including the Tropicana and the Stardust. The Kansas City family didn't need a Teamster loan to secure their interest in the Tropicana, but Civella, in a shrewd political move, voluntarily shared a portion of the skim with the powerful Chicago outfit as a gesture of respect and to cement their alliance. According to testimony from Cleveland mob boss Angelo Leonardo, who later became a government informant, the crime families in Cleveland, Kansas City, and Milwaukee each received $40,000 per month in skim money from casino operations. But maintaining this empire required intimidation. In 1975, Alan Glick, a San Diego businessman who controlled several Las Vegas casinos with Teamster loans, was summoned to Kansas City for a meeting with Nick Civella. In a hotel room, Civella explained the facts of life. According to Glick's later testimony, Civella told him, "Cling to every word I say. If it would be my choice, you wouldn't leave this room alive. You owe us $1.2 million. I want that paid. In addition, we own part of your corporation, and you are to do nothing to interfere with it." For years, Civella denied everything. During a rare interview in 1970, he stated, "I even deny, to my knowledge, that organized crime exists in Kansas City. I am not a joiner. I am not even a member of the Knights of Columbus." In 1979, he declared, "There isn't any factual, any evidentiary proof anywhere that Nick Civella is the leader or the boss of any criminal organization. I say it in spades, and I say it in double spades, that I'm not the head of any kind of organization like that, and there's no proof of such." But Civella's denials would prove hollow, because while he was publicly proclaiming his innocence, the FBI was listening to every word he said in private. The beginning of the end came in January 1970, just 4 days before the Kansas City Chiefs faced the Minnesota Vikings in Super Bowl IV. An FBI agent climbed a telephone pole directly across from the Northview Social Club, known in the underworld as The Trap, at 5th and Troost, and connected a wiretap. 20 blocks away, FBI agents settled in with coffee, ashtrays, and headphones. Within minutes, they heard bookie Frank Tusa directing his operation. They heard big gamblers like Saul Landy placing bets. They heard Tusa's panic as Kansas City bettors poured tens of thousands of dollars onto their hometown Chiefs, creating a dangerous imbalance in his betting book. On the day before the Super Bowl, Tusa called Nick Civella and reported he had $47,360 in bets on the Chiefs that needed to be laid off with another bookie. The mob's business model depended on keeping bets balanced on both sides so they could collect the 10% vig from losing bettors without taking on risk themselves. When Tusa called for guidance, Civella made a fatal mistake. He talked. The FBI now had Nick Civella's voice on tape, directly involved in illegal gambling operations. In October 1970, FBI agents Bill Ousley and Lee Flosey arrested Civella, and one of the government's key witnesses would be Saul Landy, the wealthy scrapyard owner who had placed bets and could tie the interstate gambling operation directly to Civella, but Saul Landy would never testify. In November 1970, less than a month after Civella's release on bond, 4 young black men invaded Landy's home in what was staged to look like a robbery. Saul Landy was murdered. His wife was viciously raped. The 4 men were quickly arrested, and the truth emerged. They had been hired for $1,000 each by Thomas Jefferson Lee, who had been recruited by Johnny Franco Vigiglia, a Civella associate. Franco Vigiglia wanted to prove his worth to Nick Civella. While Civella was never charged with the murder, everyone understood what had happened. A witness had been eliminated. Despite this, Civella was convicted on the gambling charges in 1975. By 1978, federal authorities had escalated their investigation. The Kansas City FBI office suspected that the Civella family was involved in the River Quay gang war, a brutal conflict that had left multiple buildings bombed and several mobsters dead. On June 28, 1978, agents placed a listening device in the Villa Capri Pizzeria, a mob hangout. They were hoping to gather intelligence about the gang war. What they recorded instead would bring down the entire Las Vegas skimming operation. At the Villa Capri with the Bee Gees, disco hit Stayin' Alive playing ironically in the background, FBI agents intercepted a conversation between Carl Tuffy DeLuna, the Kansas City underboss, and Joe Agosto, the Civella family's man inside the Tropicana. The conversation revealed details about the Las Vegas casino skim and led agents to expand their surveillance operation, codenamed Operation Strawman. The most extraordinary intercept came on November 1978 at a house owned by one of Civella's relatives, the residents of the Marlowe family. Nick Civella held the meeting there because he believed his own home would attract too much law enforcement attention. He was right to be paranoid, but wrong about which location was safer. The FBI had bugged the Marlowe house and recorded a 6-hour meeting that would prove devastating. Carl Thomas, a respected casino executive who had worked at Circus Circus, Slots A Go-Go, and the Stardust before becoming casino manager at the Tropicana, was there. So was Joe Agosto. And so were Nick Civella, his brother Carl Cork Civella, and underboss Carl DeLuna. The Marlowe tapes, as they became known, captured Thomas boasting about his skimming exploits, explaining in profanity-laced detail exactly how money was stolen from casino counting rooms before it ever appeared on the books. The FBI now had everything they needed. The irony was almost poetic. Nick Civella had been able to attend this meeting only because he had convinced authorities to grant him a medical release from federal prison. His lawyers had argued he needed treatment for health problems. Now, those same recordings would be used to revoke his parole and send him back to prison. And when he truly needed a medical release years later, his prior deception would haunt him. Based on the Marlowe tapes and other surveillance, federal prosecutors moved swiftly. In November 1981, a grand jury in Kansas City indicted Civella, his brother Carl DeLuna, Joe Agosto, Carl Thomas, and others on charges involving skimming and hidden ownership interests in the Tropicana. But Nick Civella had another legal problem. In 1980, he had been convicted of attempting to bribe a federal prison warden in Fort Worth, Texas. He had offered the warden $5,000 to transfer his nephew, Anthony Tony Ripe Civella, from a Texarkana penitentiary to a minimum security facility. For this crime, Civella was sentenced to 4 years at Leavenworth Penitentiary. Behind bars, Civella's health deteriorated rapidly. The lung cancer that would ultimately kill him was spreading. His attorneys filed multiple requests for early release, but federal authorities were skeptical. Civella had cried wolf before, using medical releases to attend mob meetings. In February 1983, Civella's condition became undeniable. Doctors at the Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri, confirmed that his lung cancer was terminal. He might have only weeks to live. The U.S. Parole Commission finally granted him early release on February 28, 1983. Civella was released to his family on March 1st, and they hoped he could spend his final days at home. But it was too late for even that small mercy. Upon arriving in Kansas City aboard an air ambulance, Civella was immediately admitted to Menorah Medical Center in critical condition. He never left. For 11 days, he lay in that hospital room, unable to speak, unable to acknowledge his family, his consciousness slipping away. One family friend later said, "He never knew he was out, never really gained reality." On Saturday, March 12, 1983, 1 week before what would have been his 71st birthday, Nick Civella died. For almost 24 hours, his death was kept secret. Then, on Sunday afternoon, his attorney, Byron Neal Fox, announced that his client had died of, quote, complications associated with lung cancer. The death was confirmed, and the family began making arrangements. A private wake was held at Civella Funeral Home in the North End, the predominantly Italian neighborhood where Civella's criminal career had begun more than 60 years earlier. On Tuesday, March 15th, a private funeral was held at Holy Rosary Catholic Church, known as the Mother Church of Kansas City's Italian community. Reporters were barred from entry. Hundreds of family members and friends attended. Burial followed at St. Mary's Cemetery. Nick Civella's death marked the end of an era for the Kansas City mob. His brother, Carl Cork Civella, took over leadership, but the organization would never regain its former power. The surveillance technology that had captured Civella's voice, the wiretaps, the hidden microphones, the patient work of FBI agents, had exposed the inner workings of the Kansas City crime family and its connections to Las Vegas, Chicago, and beyond. The convictions that followed Operation Strawman dismantled the infrastructure that had made the skim possible. In the 1995 film Casino, director Martin Scorsese depicted the Las Vegas skim, showing how FBI surveillance in Kansas City, in a grocery store in the movie, though in reality it was the Villa Capri Pizzeria, exposed the conspiracy. The character of Vincent Borelli, played by Joseph Rigano, is loosely based on Nick Civella. The movie captures the paranoia, the violence, and ultimately the downfall of the mob's Las Vegas empire. The man who died silent in that Kansas City hospital room had spent decades perfecting the art of keeping secrets. He had escaped the raid at Appalachian. He had dodged conviction after conviction. He had built an empire on intimidation, corruption, and careful organization. But in the end, his own voice betrayed him. The wiretaps that captured Nick Civella talking about gambling during the Super Bowl, discussing skimming operations at the Marlowe House, and directing his criminal enterprise from a prison phone became the evidence that brought him down. There's a final, haunting irony in how Nick Civella died. For a man who had always been so careful about what he said, who had publicly denied the very existence of organized crime while privately running one of the most powerful criminal syndicates in the Midwest, to die without the ability to speak seems almost like cosmic justice. The words that were his undoing in life were taken from him in death. And perhaps that silence, broken only by the steady beep of hospital monitors and the quiet sobs of his family, was the only dignity he was granted at the end. The Kansas City mob would continue for years after Civella's death, but never with the same reach or power. Federal prosecutions continued. New technologies made surveillance easier. The glamorous days of Las Vegas skimming were over. The Tropicana changed hands. The Stardust eventually closed, and the North End neighborhood where Giuseppe Nicoli Civella first learned the ways of the street became just another chapter in American history. Nick Civella was buried in a quiet ceremony, attended by family and close associates. His wife, Catherine, who had stood by him for nearly 50 years through arrests, trials, and imprisonments, mourned him. His brother, Carl, who had been his closest confidant throughout his criminal career, carried on the family business. But everyone knew that an era had ended. The boy who was arrested at age 10 for being incorrigible. The bootlegger who spent 2 months in prison in 1932. The precinct worker who made friends with the Democratic machine. The bodyguard who rose to become the boss. The boss who attended the Appalachian meeting and escaped. The name in Nevada's Black Book. The voice on FBI wiretaps. The Godfather who died silent. This was Nick Civella, a man whose life was defined by the American underworld and whose death marked the end of the mob's golden age in Kansas City and Las Vegas. His grave in St. Mary's Cemetery stands as a quiet monument to a violent life. And somewhere in FBI archives, preserved on old magnetic tape, his voice still exists, directing gambling operations, discussing million-dollar skimming schemes, threatening businessmen, running an empire. The voice that could never be silenced by his denials was ultimately silenced by cancer. But those recordings remain, a permanent testament to how Nick Civella, the man who tried so hard to avoid leaving evidence, ended up creating an audio record of his own criminal enterprise. The Kansas City mob would never be the same, and neither would Las Vegas. The age of the mafia skim was over, brought down by technology, by determined FBI agents, and by Nick Civella's own words. He had lived by the code of omerta, the code of silence, but when he spoke, the FBI was listening, and in the end, that made all the difference.